The spider was completely unprepared for assault from above by an ashtray. It never had a friend it could count on. It never knew its blood group. It never saw itself changing or any need to. It never said, "No more excuses." It never felt tempted by drugs. It never knew the itch to the nearest bar. Its earning power was never an issue. It was never hurt by a few home truths. It never did anything for anyone. It never knew the myth of Wyatt Earp. It never hoped for more than was likely. It never had a watchtower thrust at it. It never saw a rainbow or a bunch of flowers dropped into an open grave. It never wrote an essay on the works of Alexander Pope. It never filled in an application form. It never married for love or money. It never had a honeymoon in a hotel. It never knew who was prime minister. It never knew if it was lucky or not. It never shopped for clothes. It never smiled. It never felt like a paperclip in a jar, in a cupboard, in a shed. It never carried a briefcase. It never missed the last train. It never slept off a hangover. It never thought it was Marlon Brando. It never grew a beard or shaved in cold water. It never fished in the Mississippi. It never heard rumors about itself. It never had to face its inadequacy. It never had any wild ideas. It never had any wild ideas drummed out of it. It never laughed at a copper's helmet. It never gave a false name and address. It never saw the Marx Brothers or listened to Sgt. Pepper. It never knew what was in fashion. It never got careless or said it was past caring. It never left its clothes in a heap. It never preferred to remain anonymous. It never wondered who wrote Shakespeare or invented light bulbs. It never thought it would win an award one day. It never moved because it didn't like the neighborhood. It never fastened its seatbelt for a rough ride. It never played a guitar that had just one string. It never looked for warts in its armpits. It never turned its back on the dreams of its youth. It never felt guilty for wasting time. It never considered circumcision. It never got hard-ons traveling by bus. It never got sentimental at Christmas. It never thought the carpet and curtains clashed. It never spent a night awake with its partner, wishing the photograph album empty. It never read about itself on the front page. It never had more than its fair share of problems. It was never diagnosed manic depressive. It was never found guilty of a thing. It never made a list of things to do. It never waited for the right partner to come along or became half of a couple with a headache between them. It never dropped earwax in the ashtray. It never had a first at the races. It never tied a donkey to someone sleeping. It never had a pension plan. It never wanted to improve itself or thought it was better than it was. It never got serious over the funniest things. It never had a boss for a friend or a friend who thought he was a boss. It never stared out to sea. It never watched the tide come in. It never worried whether or not it created a good impression. It never took notice of a road sign. It never put up a barbed wire fence. It never wept inside headphones, briefly. It never learned to think things over more, to peep before it plunged. It never took off its shoes to save the carpet. It never learned to spell archaeologist. It never scratched its arse in a food queue. It never read a book about Hitler. It never met a neo-oligarch. It never used washing powder or learned to start a fire. It never used a telephone box. It never accepted a cigarette. It never laughed at its own joke. It never sat in the back row or dreamt it was the steering wheel through James Dean's chest. It never grew hair to its shoulders. It never picked its feet on the bed. It never had a 21st birthday party. It never washed its hands of anybody. It never needed an explanation or a diet. It never said, "Too gentle for my liking, too jolly." It never taught itself German, telling its partner to be quiet so it could concentrate. It never worried about what it was swallowing. It never looked for heroes and villains. It never smiled apologetically. It never pressed a blade into its wrist. It never wished it lived in a caravan. It never fried bacon and eggs. It never felt like a fat catalog of books published in limited editions no one wants anyhow, at any price. It never tore a book in half. It never felt like it was an abstract that had everybody shaking their heads. It never held a gun to its head. It never felt a wire tightened around its throat. It was completely unprepared for assault from above by an ashtray. I should blush and compose a soundtrack for the moment.